Hello, and welcome to the AAMFT podcast, your all-access pass to the latest news, developments, and thought leaders in the world of systemic therapy. We strive to relate, educate, and innovate, one episode at a time. I'm your host, Dr. Eli Karam, and we're brought to you by the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy. Our podcast explores topics that relationship-based therapists care about. In addition to featuring unique conversations and interviews with established experts, our show provides information and education on direct practice and emerging trends in the MFT profession. For more information, please visit us at aamft.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy the show. Today we're talking about global mental health and professional development and training with two great guests, Laurie, Charles, and Saliha, Bava. And I will tell you more about them in a second. But first, I'll tell you about the Handbook. The Handbook is the first of its kind, the Handbook of Systemic Therapy, a resource for clinicians, researchers, educators, graduate students, policymakers. There's something in this 4-volume set for everything. It's a groundbreaking reference work on both the profession and the practice of systemic family therapy. It integrates scholarly literature on systemic interventions focused on children, couples, and families into one single resource. As I said, 4 volumes. Volume 1 is about the theoretical practice and research and policy foundations on the profession. Topics in Volume 2 are all around children and adolescents. Volume 3 covers couples. And Volume 4, what we've been focusing on in our 4-part live podcast series, is all about global mental health and family therapy over the lifespan. And this is an amazing work. You can find more about it at aamft.org/handbook. You know, MFTs sometimes are considered United States centric, but global mental health and taking these systemic concepts and applying them to other cultures and populations, so very important. And we're doing that today with our two guests. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. But first, also, you want to visit brightervision.com. They are the sponsor for our live podcast series. All members of AAMFT, believe it or not, get 2 months free. And your Brighter Vision, a one-stop shop for all things practice related. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Laurie Charles. She's an LMFT whose consultation practice is focused on scaling up family therapy practices. I like that. Across country context and multiple clinical settings, with an emphasis on enhancing public mental health initiatives with vulnerable populations. She holds a PhD in family therapy from Nova Southeastern. She has 2 master's degrees, one from Our Lady of the Lake University and another one in international relations from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. She's been part of numerous mental health and psychosocial support projects in diverse places like Lebanon, Kosovo, Cameroon, and Sri Lanka, among others, as a family therapy trainer and consultant. She's also serves as an analyst who's written countless things about the efficiency and integrity of these psychosocial support projects, and she'll talk about some of that today. Saliha Bava is an LMFT with over 20 years of experience in human and organizational development, diversity, and collaboration. She's an associate professor at the School of Social and Behavioral Sciences at Mercy College in New York. She is a Taos Institute associate and currently the director of research and a consultant to the International Trauma Studies Program, affiliated with Columbia University. Saliha received her PhD in human development with a specialization in marriage and family therapy from Virginia Tech. And as the former director of the Houston Galveston Institute, she focused on organization development and community engagement. Most recently, she's consulted on disaster preparedness and response to organizations in nonprofit and governmental sectors. She publishes and presents nationally and internationally on collaborative practices, collective trauma, and therapist creativity from a relational and performative play perspective. We could do a whole nother podcast on that. All right. So happy to have you both with us. If you've ever listened to the show before, the first question is always, how did you get not only into family therapy or systemic psychotherapy, but specifically working in the context of global mental health? So we'll start with you, Laurie.
Thank you. Thanks for the the intro, and great to be here and have the conversation, and really excited about the chapter and these four discussions that you're planning for the podcast around international work. So what brought me to global mental health? I mean, it's that, that idea that it's like where you punctuate something happening in a system. You could throw up a globe or a set of ideas that I've experienced in my life, and each one I think would make sense for how I sit here today. But probably the most formative thing that I rely on a day-to-day basis, besides my degree in family therapy and the focus on qualitative research that I learned during that degree at Nova, is that I joined the Peace Corps 2 weeks after my dissertation defense. I mean, I had planned it, so I didn't just take off. I had planned it, and I departed 2 weeks after my defense, and I didn't see my published dissertation for another year and a half. I really had wanted to join the Peace Corps before I got my master's degree in family therapy, but I had put it off. And so this was a way to circle back to something I wanted to do. I also thought I'll never be able to do it again if I don't do it now. And I was desperate to do something radically different from my studies. So for me, that was living immersed in a language that wasn't my native tongue. So that has been formative for me. And that was French.
Where did you go, Laurie, on the Peace Corps?
I went to Togo, West Africa.
Wow.
And I've worked in many times in Africa since then, but that was the first time I'd been to Africa. And I did not know where Togo was when I was assigned Togo. I had to go look with a friend of mine in Fort Lauderdale. Where is this country? Living in French was formative, and living in a place where I had to rely on the skills that I had learned, but in a very different way than I had been trained. They were still relevant, but in a totally different way, was formative. I also learned about the resource curse. I learned about colonization, because Togo had been colonized by France, and there's still a really deep relationship with France as that happens in former colonies. So it's endless, the list of things. But if I had to say, that moment, it's right at the top. And last week was Peace Corps week, so I have to give a shout out for Peace Corps. I would do it again in a second. Do it again.
Yeah, we've had Froma Walsh on the show, and she talked about the formative experience in the Peace Corps. So I think it's one of those amazing. I've never met anyone that has had that experience that hasn't had it profoundly shape their life, both personal and professional. Saliha, what's your story?
Eli, first, thank you. Thanks to inviting Laurie and me to be here. And it's exciting to have this conversation. My story is I was born into global mental health. Sitting in the US, we think of global mental health as everything outside of the US, right? So I was born in global South. I'm Indian by birth and origin, and I arrived here, as you said in my introduction, to do my PhD at Virginia Tech. So I didn't sit there thinking I'm global mental health. I come here and then get to see myself and redefine as being part of the global South, right? So we're going to get into that, which is what is global mental health and how do we do the us and them part of it. My story partially also includes this label I like to kind of put on myself, a pot stirrer, a person who hangs out in the edges or steps out of tradition. So I can give you lots of examples of how I've done that. But what brought
system pusher.
Yeah, right. We don't know it. But from the age of 3, apparently my family story goes that I've been leaving home, that I ran away to something, right? That's my mom's story about me, because I went to the playground because I hadn't had enough time on the playground. So that's the child in me who keeps driving me to these places where I'm curious, where I'm like, I don't stop to think that others are not going there, others who look like me or should be performing in a particular way. I go towards what calls to my heart, what makes a difference in the world. And when I finished my master's in social work, this was in India, there was a foreign funding agency that was interviewing for people, right? And there was this tension of the finalist, a man and a woman, me, right? And I got the job, and it required people to travel to rural parts of India. I was born and raised in Delhi, in urban parts, and this was me entering what would be called the developmental sector and working with people who would be considered indigenous here or untouchables based on the caste system. So we'll come back to that in a minute or two. But it was kind of interesting to go into that place as an outsider coming into something that's part of your country, but speaks to the very issues we're going to be speaking today about. And so that's just the entry point of where I went, and then we can continue into it. But it's a very telling place. And what also brought me into global mental health when I got here is my work in India, working with refugees around riot, and then working around Katrina and hurricane disaster issues here in disaster mental health. And then there were a couple of projects I've done with the International Trauma Studies program using theater with the Liberian population in Staten Island in New York City. We have a huge Liberian population. We'll get into that a little bit as part of the stories come in. Last but not the least, there was a 3-year international research program that was funded by IDRC in Canada and hosted by the International Conflict Resolution Center in Northern Ireland. And they were looking at states that had experienced civil war or violence, and how was mental health and psychosocial practices addressing social transformation and the relationship between those. So I've always been at the intersection of community and clinical, if that makes sense, and what I'm getting at, and that's part of what global mental health is.
Yes, you both have two amazing backgrounds and certainly are experts on this topic. But let's start with a basic definition. If I am listening to this for the first time and I practice again in this United States centric kind of way of thinking, first of all, what is global mental health broadly? And then why should I care? Why is it important to me as a systemic therapist?
Well, I have a quick answer that everyone will resonate with is COVID-19. COVID-19 is a public health emergency wherever you are on the globe, but internationally, it's officially declared what's called the PHEIC by the World Health Organization, which is part of the United Nations. So that right there is what global mental health looks like when I travel to Lebanon to work with Syrian psychiatrists and psychologists, or when I travel to Kosovo or Sri Lanka, or anytime there's a response to a humanitarian situation. And that's more my background, is in a humanitarian situation. So a pandemic is global by nature. That's what that means. But you can see in the US, even, we have so many different kinds of responses happening across communities. So some of that's states doing different things, but also inside a state. I'm in Massachusetts. It's very different where I live right now. And even like 20 miles away, it's quite different, the western side of Massachusetts. And so in global mental health, we talk about the disparities across populations in access to healthcare. And in global mental health, global mental health care. That's all it is. It's things that we do all the time, I think, and we're sensitive to as family therapists. But the global part for me is when it becomes multilateral, which is multi-country. So here's the COVID-19 again. I mean, we talked, Saliha and I were talking, we couldn't have a better setup for talking about global mental health, because we are all responding now in the field of global mental health. And disparities, I think, make a lot of sense to family therapists. And so when you cross a border, the conversation about disparities, I mean, sometimes the language is different, and the countries that you work with, literally the language is different. So that's a given, right? You're working already inside English and outside English. But how disparities are discussed and what's the history of that disparity. And so really an interesting thing that research now about the pandemic that you can read in the Lancet is how many low and middle income countries have responded so much better with a lower morbidity and mortality to COVID-19 than a high income country. So right there that's global mental health.
Did you want to add to that, Sally, about the focus of global mental health or why emerging therapists in the United States should care about it?
I think for two reasons why we should care about it. One is we sit on the top of the pile of what defines mental health, sitting in the US especially. And we know that these ideas are being imported, are being taken all across the globe. And the second is we are also questioning our own practices within our own country. How does a pandemic bring out racialism? How does it happen? And this is not just happening in the US, it's showing that the pandemic is affecting people of color across the globe, right? So there's always been healthcare disparities, but also there have been disparities in how ill health manifests itself. And we have known, and as family therapists, we know that our individual health is held by our family, by our communities. We know this very well. And we know how to engage families and communities. And that's the call of the time.
Yeah.
And that's the shift that's happening in global mental health. As Laurie was talking about it, it has had a very biomedical focus, and it's this closing the gap. And it's been kind of the high-income countries helping the low-income countries. That's been the subtext. So it continues to show what we experience here, which is who gets to speak for whom, when, where, and how, and who learns from whom. And what's coming up as global mental health is exactly what Laurie is saying the pandemic is bringing is low-income countries, some countries that have had SARS before, are much better equipped at being responsive to this global disaster.
Many times as systemic therapists, we think of the micro, what's happening inside the therapy room. And part of spanning the gap to global mental health is thinking about what's been certainly done successfully in other countries, especially other low-income countries, but also how you expand your focus to communities and an engagement level, which I really like how you said, or how the macro societal issues impact the micro practice of systemic couple and family therapy. So can you guys speak a little more about engagement, and then what you write about in the chapter, which really resonated with me, technology transfer? Can you define that for our listeners and talk about how that applies to global mental health?
So technology transfer is like a very fancy way to talk about training, training and teaching and supervision and support. It has a reference point. I mean, if you want to understand why that word and in that way, and that's not necessarily important to know unless you're really interested in economics. And I think it's fascinating because technology really is any information that people have that can promote their capacity to produce either a product or a service. That's all it is. So that's where that technology word comes from. The transfer is also attached to that. But I've used this term a few times. I picked it up, and it's used in the context that I work is knowledge transfer more commonly. And people have different kinds of reactions to it. And so I want to, just like any kind of label, I think we have to be so thoughtful of how we hold on to it lightly. It's really relevant depending on where you are, but it's training and capacity building. What Saliha and I talk about in the chapter that I think is so important to emphasize, and really where there's a place for family therapists to document and research and illustrate, is how do you do that? I mean, it doesn't just happen. It's not just literally handing a tangible thing to someone else. It is a process, and it is a relational process. And therein lies all the complexity. And, not everyone can do it. I mean, it's not easy. So, I mean, we know this, like not everyone's cut out to be a family therapist, or some people have to learn some skill in family therapy and have to work a bit harder and some people are naturals. So that also exists when I'm working outside the US. What are the natural skill sets that people have? And then how do you scale up what's needed for them, depending on what's happening in their country?
When we think about engagement, I think we know this as systemic therapists that when social inequalities and inequities remain unaddressed, right? Mental health, family health, community health, all gets impacted. We know this. So one of the things we write in the book is that we're not, even though we know this, we're not at the table of global mental health. Right. So we are saying we need to wake up to this fact that we are very well trained in thinking systemically. We know how to bring the macro into the room. We know how to take our micro skills. One of the things I'm working on is how do we address racial injustice through relational practices, not just social justice, but relational justice. So we know this back and forth very well. So when we think about engagement, I think it's not just thinking about taking a training or what our theories are, our models are, and transferring it, but being, like you said, being in an engagement, multilateral process that Laurie's got her new book on, which speaks to this idea of engagement, not only with each other, but with the different systems, including the states, the communities, the organizations that are involved. Like I work for a funder, but I was in rural India, and I was talking about that earlier. I was working in rural India. I was looking at development projects for men, women, and children who were living on lands that belonged to them, but didn't know they had land rights. And so when you're talking about their mental health and engagement, it took us engaging the community, talking about farming, talking about multinationals coming in, and talking about the displacement that was coming in as a way of talking about what was health and wellness for them. So engagement means a number of things, and we know how to do that from a systemic conceptualization perspective, but also when we work multi-systemic. So I can go on, but I'll pause.
Yeah, I love both of your ideas about that because, yes, we are, as family therapists, process experts. We understand systems and how to expand the system. So if that is the common thread as relational healers, what we bring to the table, then we can more easily think about how we would expand that into other cultures and societies. Speaking of culture, I will talk about, we have this Q&A box where you can put in questions throughout our hour together. So question from Doug Jones in the chat room. He says, what about culture? How do you factor in culture? Do you think people should assimilate or seek support for cultural uniqueness? What as a family therapist do you need to know about the culture you're entering into?
I mean, that's a great question. And I there's a really cool quote I like about like that, culture is immutable. It's mutable. So immutable. And when you're working internationally, you are doing all the micro analysis that with the people who you're working with on the ground, but there's also a meta level of analysis. So there are organizations have cultures, teams inside organizations have cultures, professionals have, cultures, epistemic communities. These are all really relevant on the international plane. You're not working, I almost never ever work with another family therapist when I'm working internationally. I think I can think of one time in about 24 projects that I've worked directly with a family therapist. Culture is critical, but it's a meta. I would say, like, really, you have to meta your ideas about what does that mean, and then it's never only just one. So this is also like, I don't know, it's not like a family in the room, but when you work with a larger system and you have 20 clients that you see a week, you can imagine exponentially how that might look when you're crossing a border and you're working inside of a multilateral organization. So I don't know if I answered the question, but that's what I thought of when he asked it. And assimilation, I mean, in a way, I sort of like desimilate from my family therapy background and I assimilate to the culture of the project. And of course, that's constructed as we go along. I mean, these trainings take several days and that mind, that systemic mind, just like we see in the training in the US, if it's really good, right? Or have an experience in the classroom, it's constructed as we go. And it's very, very powerful. But like, I think that balance between like, what do I bring and what do I need to let go so I can understand what's happening, where I am.
Yeah, I always say you got to learn the system before you can change the system. So really being open to culture and the culture of wherever you're entering, more than just ethnic or some type of diversity, is the culture of even the system of care. And like you said, you're the only family therapist usually when you're working internationally. So learning how all those other pieces of the team work together. What are your thoughts on culture?
So it's interesting because culture for me is very dynamic. Culture is what we create through the everyday interactions that get over time reified, institutionalized. And so for us, as we prepare to go from whatever our culture is, we have to stop and think, are you thinking about country culture? And as you're saying, there's the culture of mental health. There's the cultural or social stories, right? So you may come to India, and my story about India is not the story that you're going to encounter when you get to India and you talk to a room full of people. So there is no one culture. And yet there are certain historical markers, social markers, linguistic, meaning-making markers that make up culture. So we are, as family therapists, we are systemic thinkers, and that is shaping us as we are shaping it. We are in the room of that dynamism. So I don't think about it, and I think this is part of it. Like even in family therapy, we were learning, what are people's ethnicities and what are the stories that go with it, as if it's fixed. Mm-hmm. And it's highly problematic because all stories leave out some things and it's spoken from a particular perspective. Yeah. So I think we need to have that critical gaze to culture as a social practice rather than a stagnant thing. And so how am I engaging it? Whose story? Who's bringing me into the country? What's their story about this country? What is the person who's in the room? How do they see me and how do I see them?
Yeah, to that point, I think a lot of times in the US, we have a certain understanding of mental health, and we think that's how it is everywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Or even as MFTs, we look for strength and health. It's still very pathology diagnosis based. So how do we refrain from this kind of one-sided export only, so to speak, as you mentioned in the chapter, view of mental health? How do we learn and be open to different ways to view that when we're working across borders?
You want to go first, Saliha, on that one?
I mean, I think I've been speaking to that. It's like check our own hubris, Laurie. Yeah. And I love that word because we talk about this notion of cultural humility in our field. And before that came cultural competency. So what we've been talking, if cultural stagnant culture is markers, that's that cultural competency model. And if you're taking that and going, I think that's that export-import model that we're talking about, that you're taking a preconceived idea rather than being in this interactive moment that we as therapists know, as family therapists, as systemic therapists, that something in the room is emerging. And I need to hold, and Laurie said this, hold our ideas lightly and engage. This is that portion that goes back to the knowledge transfer too. It's not there's this knowledge module, even though it's written, maybe WHO brings you, UN brings you. I was working for the international organization SWISAID. So they bring us in some capacity of expertise, but it's what you said, Eli, it's the capacity of process. So if we stay in the process orientation and hold our ideas lightly, then knowledge becomes a co-creative process of back and forth. It's not like, okay, here is a genogram. I'm going to teach you how to make a genogram. It's like, how does this make sense in your world? Where do you start conversations when you start inquiring into family? How does family show up in conversation?
Yeah, as you all talk, I keep coming back to one of these therapist common factors of curiosity, not assuming that you know, but being curious. And you actually in the chapter talk about respectful curiosity. You know, our listeners love when you can give some clinical examples. So I'm curious, Laurie, I hear you're a great storyteller. So maybe you can give us some examples of how to be respectfully curious when thinking about mental health and other cultures across borders.
I thought of one as Saliha was talking, I'd forgotten. So some of my stories I've written about, I have put in different publications, but some of them I have to be quite sensitive in what I say. But so speaking of genograms, that's what was the cue. So I did a training once. Okay, so actually before I say that, like, the question that you asked about how do we not impose, I'm always in the hands of people that I trust. So there is always a local person. If someone who's based in, a regional office, then they have a local person that they trust. And that's my in,
So you always are accompanied by a credible source. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, do you remember all the articles I forget who wrote them around the referring person, understanding the referring person? It's kind of like that. Like, I really need to know, and it's partly to make my job easier or security reasons or whatever. But so I did one training, and I can say the country, this was in Libya, and I had my training mapped out. I knew what I was going to do. I was sitting in the hotel with my contact person who wanted to look at the training, modules before I started the next day. So this is someone that I'd worked with before and I knew, so I was comfortable doing that. But no one has ever asked me that. I mean, now it's common, but before I would just be brought in here, do your thing, and it looks great. But so here's my contact wanting to look, and he saw on day 3, I was doing a module on genograms. So this is a psychiatrist who's well-versed in family therapy and very familiar with the material. He's like, oh, no, Laurie, you need to do that on the first day. And I was like, I mean, who would do that, right? Imagine, it just didn't fit, like how I thought about how I should train. But this is someone who lived in the country, who spoke the language, knew the material, and I trusted him. So I moved it to day 1, and he was absolutely correct. And to this day, I mean, so these participants only spoke Arabic. So I'm working with people who are translating and interpreting. But, genograms are lovely because you don't need any words to understand what is being presented about the family. And that was a big aha for me. I was like, wow, I don't need to know Arabic to understand. And they don't need to understand my English. So that was one thing that happened. Like immediately we connected. And then Libya is full of tribes and clans, and family is much too small a term for them. So they were amazing at producing genograms on day one. And we did it throughout the whole training. So moments like that, I mean, they don't come out of nowhere. I'm using people in the system from the get-go. When we start having the conversations about, are you interested? We're doing this. And that's also how we, I think, work micro in our work in the US, but letting go of what I thought how it should go. And I have many, many examples of that. Another one around an English speaking group, more fluent in English, but also Arabic speaking. You know how we talk about family conflict? We would say, you and I would say, okay, so in this country, there was an actual war happening, a real conflict. So as soon as I said conflict, I couldn't tell because it was Arabic, but it stopped everything. And my contact person, a different person who also I trusted, came to me and talked about, like, the conflict was the way that they talked about the war. So for me to say family conflict, which is just such a benign term, but not where they were. So I was lucky because I had someone who I trusted, who trusted me and was okay to interrupt me and correct me. And it's interesting because if I don't speak the language of the people I'm training, I'm not going to hear those things to correct, like we might do in an
It's harder to read the feedback when you can't speak the language.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, and so I started also doing lots of other things to try to communicate, and we're also good at this, I think, in family therapy, like sort of nonverbals. And in a training room, you can really move around a lot. Anyway, those are two examples, like following the pacing of the people who are on the ground, like local knowledge, basically. It's local knowledge.
Yeah, that's one of the big takeaways so far from our talk. You have to have someone a stakeholder that has the cultural cachet, so to speak, that has the in, and you have to be comfortable enough and humble enough to take that feedback and know from the beginning, not only take that feedback, that you need that feedback. So yeah, that's a great story. What do you think about this respectful curiosity, Saliha?
I was thinking about, as Laurie was speaking about it, is this notion of practices and perspectives go hand in hand. And we write about that in the chapter. When we're coming as an outsider, we are bringing certain practices, right, based on our perspectives, and being able to shift and enter into our host's perspectives redefines what the practice will look like and what it will be. So that's the respectful curiosity, which is seeking permission, not just assuming that this is going to work, staying in that place of like, let's talk about this together, right? Noticing how language is both a facilitator and a blocker. And I'm reminded of a workshop you talked about. We could do a whole workshop, a whole podcast on play and performance. That is part of one of my other areas of scholarship. And I was in China doing this workshop on play. And by play, I mean the relationally co-creative process of trial and error by which we create the world around us, to put it simply, but it's a much more complex moment. So I'm talking about the word play. The person who had invited me, he and I had some conversations and had history. So I had assumed that he and I were on the same page when we were talking about the word play in the way I was talking about it. When it was getting translated as sports. And that's one of the more common definitions of play, games and sports. So during the first break, I was there for like 2 days. This was the first break. Another very respected local trainer, who was also trained here in the US and gone back to her home country, came up to me and said, I don't think he's talking about play in the same way that you're talking about play. And that's where relationships matter, because if we didn't have the relationship, I'm not sure if somebody would have come and brought that to me, because language and context matters, but relationships also matter. And that's one of the things that family therapists know. And I think she came from a place of, she knew that I wouldn't want to be misunderstood, not just because of the ideas I was bringing, but it's that care for the person, if that makes sense. For me, that was the opposite version of respectful curiosity in the sense of how she approached it.
So much, as you said, you have to do that so that these family therapy interventions don't get lost in translation. And that could be a very, if you're trying to be helpful, but if you make a faux pas that you don't even know is a faux pas, it changes the whole context of everything. So both of your stories point to that. The other thing I was thinking about, we all went to 3 really good programs of MFT training, COAMFT programs, but I don't know about you, but I never got any training on global mental health or anything outside of the borders. As you said, we've moved from cultural awareness and now into cultural humility, and we've done a nice job of blending that into our accredited training programs. But much of what you all do is train therapists how to do this work, and which is a focus of the chapter. So if our audience is, kind of split between emerging professional students and preclinical fellows and also very seasoned MFTs. But if I don't want to, if I'm listening to this, I'm like, hey, we're family therapists are needed. And now with technology, you can be helpful like we're doing right now without even leaving the confines of your home. So if I want to get more training on how to interact with across borders, how to be helpful consultant to this technology transfer of family therapy to other cultures, how do I get trained in this and where do I go?
Our favorite phrase that Laurie and I use is leave home.
Yeah.
Leave your home. That's the first step. Whatever home means. I don't mean just our family home as we think about it, but family therapy is our home. So how are you getting other perspectives engaged in? Laurie got hers in international relations or diplomacy? Relations. And I feel my training comes from my background in social work, right? And the way social work was done in India was very much using Western models. The textbooks were all from the US. So I got inducted into Western perspectives. So for me, leaving home is to reconnect with home, if that makes sense, theoretically, conceptually. So there are different ways of thinking about that. But first is that critical gaze. But there's more. Laurie, what are you thinking?
I love the leaving home because it reminds me of the story that you told about when you were a little girl and you used to run away. And when I joined the Peace Corps, I was leaving home. I literally left home, but I left my family therapy home. So immersion in the place that you arrive is really useful. And you can do that on the internet, reading things. These things are already happening, these kinds of projects. And I'm involved in one. And actually, Eli, you did a podcast a while back with Fred Piercy, and he talked about it. So this is the UNODC project called TreatNet Family. So you can find TreatNet Family training package online, and you can look and see how the concepts have been translated into this evidence-informed, scaling up family therapy project that has been going on for about 2.5 years. I was part of the initial group that Fred talked about in Vienna in 2018, and I've done, I think, 5 or 6 trainings using that package. The package is public now. It's been translated into multiple languages. One of the first things I would want to tell a family therapist is, why don't you go read that? It's especially focused on substance use. That's the purpose of it, to reduce substance use in adolescents by working with the family. So that's there are tools that are already available in immersion. And I think in some of those tools that are like home, but different, it's an adaptation of how we might talk about substance use in the US. That's one thing I'd recommend is reading outside your home.
And I would say for programs and for AAMFT, we really have to look at ourselves. The question you're asking sheds the light back on us. Who are we? Are we a discipline? Are we going to be defined by the American context of being a modality? Or do we go to the spirit of what family therapy was, which was interdisciplinary?
Yeah.
So I feel like as a teacher, as a faculty member, I have to constantly look at the readings that I'm offering to my students. Are there international authors in some of those readings, right? Not to confuse international context and training, because I belong in another group, which is the International Certificate for Collaborative and Dialogic Practices. And there are 14 programs, I should say, worldwide that have taken the curriculum and made it their own, right? So as part of that network, that's another way to join in, which is what are international networks you can join in. But that's not the same as global mental health as we're talking about today. So when you think about global mental health, I think starting with what are healthcare disparities in our communities and how are we addressing that? And what's the global context within the US? US gets isolated because of all the things that we can talk about in the way we privilege whose research counts and whose doesn't. If we start engaging and questioning these practices and engaging with scholars worldwide, by staying where you are, you're leaving home, you're crossing your border of what is doable and what's not doable, what's allowable and what's not. And in that moment, you start training yourself into a new language system. One of the systems that, if you're going to travel in the global mental health context, is this language of not mental health, but mental health and psychosocial practice. That is not part of just global mental health. It's part of how, the way I came to it was through disaster response. So there is the International Agency's Standing Committee that talks about it. There is the International Organization of Migration. They have a manual, like a free manual that you can Google. And I'll put up the link in a minute here. But there are ways by which you can start getting familiar and connecting to the sub-chapters or subgroups of those organizations. WHO, Red Cross, Red Crescent, they're all entry points by which we can do it. But first, the programs have to introduce these ideas and say, we matter at the international and the global stage. If we don't go beyond the US borders in our thinking and in our practices, we're not going to be doing this work.
Now, you all are experts. People come to you now from different cultures and want your opinion and want you to consult on these collaborative teams. But if I'm just listening to this for the first time, and this is kind of blowing my mind, we have enough problems in our own country, but people actually need systemic therapists to help out. How do you go about, if you want to do this work and you have a good systemic framework and you're curious and you're open to immersing yourself in other cultures by leaving home, as you all said, how do you go and find these opportunities?
Good question. And actually, I've worked with a few MFP, fellows, Minority Fellowship Program, with AAMFT, and they talked about where's the door to doing this work? Do I really have to join the Peace Corps? No. Do I have to go do a degree in international relations? No. I mean, there are individual things I think you can take agency to do. And this idea, we're using it as a metaphor of leaving home, but reading outside your discipline. And this is something that's useful in the world that we live in today and what's happening right now, actually, in the world we're living in today. So why is it that some states in a low middle income region responded better? And what's the history of SARS? I think using what's in front of you and taking an international perspective on it. And by that, I would say, use the Janus space. And this is something I learned at Fletcher. It has been critical for helping me understand how to look at what's happening domestically and then look the other way at the international aspect of the thing that you looked at domestically. So the questions are different, but you have to look both ways, because that's how, it's a facility with the international system and the international plane. So this is United Nations organizations, WHO and IOM, and there are many kinds of standards and norms, I would say, around mental health and security and well-being that are so essential to the work we do, but very familiar for family therapists. I think they're way more familiar for family therapy scholarship and literature. That's my bias than other mental health professions. And that's been my experience. It's we have so much in common with some of these norms, about how systems work. That's a basic one. And that communities do better when the families in the community do better. So how do you help the family do better? You have to know how to work with the family. It gets pretty simple. And so, that really matters at the international level. So I would find the way that matters for the thing that you're interested in, or the community, or the region, or the language, or the problem, and then go and immerse yourself in there. Yeah, and tell us about it. Right?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, AAMFT needs to create something around this so people can connect. I'll just put out that call to our group based on this podcast and other things Laurie and I've done and others are doing. And in the Systemic Handbook, there is a lot as well. But here's a very easy example, but it also is something that is, I think, very critical. We have to look at what matters to you, what counts. So when you say you want to do global mental health, are we romanticizing? Are we making it sexy that I get to go through WHO and get to go to the UN, do something? Let's own it. That is sexy for some people, right? But that may or may not be the entry point. So here's another entry point. And not to say that is not. You can look up for job postings in the UN website. There are groups you can enter. And we as family therapists have to think. This is engagement work that I learned from India and from doing disaster response. Mental health sometimes doesn't sit apart. Sometimes and that's the psychosocial. It gets integrated. So we have to look for how am I willing to integrate and come in. Because of our systemic training, we can understand different ways that people are talking. We are already trained to move in and out, to be like more fluid than most mental health professionals are. So bring that as an access or a resource point by which you can then introduce why families and communities matter. Right now is one of the most important times because everybody's talking about families and communities because of the pandemic. So this is the time for leadership to reach out to an organization and say, here is how I can help you. And this is why we matter. So that's one thing. Sometimes you may not have an introduction. So what is an example of that is I was teaching a course last semester on disaster response and leadership. And I approached one of our communities here who works to promote anti-oppressive practices, right? And they work in India, they work in Uganda, and they work in the US. And I didn't know what I was entering into. They were going to be a project-based, community project-based partner. And once we started working, the help they wanted was to tell their stories as human rights activists. And our job was to develop a toolkit on how to get those stories told. So in the process of working with them, my students were engaging with people from Uganda, were engaging with people from the US. They haven't gotten to India yet, but that is a small entry point by which my students are getting exposed. But here is the irony of all that, Eli. None of the MFT students were able to take that course because the course was an elective, and our program, our curricular, limits the opportunities our students can have unless the student is willing to take an extra course. So the onus is left on the person rather than the system. And we have to look at our own system as to why are we closed? Why are we not replicating what isolation looks like or the isolationist practice or what is?
Man, I have so many more questions. I want to get to the chat room though in our remaining 10 minutes. This is interesting. This is flipping. We talked about crossing borders. This is taking the spirit of what we've said domestically, also something very topical, much like the pandemic, what has been happening in the United States lately with this anti-Asian sentiment. So this is Lillian Chen. She is a first-time participant in an AAMFT event, and she writes, more Asian Americans are confused and upset about the situation currently going on. Mm-hmm. Especially a lot of Asian American seniors or even middle-aged Asian women are afraid to go out and be outside. We would like to know what you all think, what we can do to help those victims who are attacked or very badly and their families are afraid. So what can we do with something that is happening locally within our borders, but has certainly international and cultural ramifications?
I'm glad this came up. I mean, so the logic of like listening to local knowledge is so critical even here. And especially when you have the impulse, like, I want to help, I want to do something that's so human. It's so appropriate, but how do I do that? So, I mean, like, first and foremost is like, what is the community asking for? What are the needs? And what's interesting, I think, about this situation, in many situations I've worked in, is it's often not clear because that group has been hidden or is silenced or silent. And we don't know. So that's a problem. I go back to the inductive, like, find some folks on the ground who can tell a little bit about what needs there might be. And that's a really positive and proactive thing to do.
Perfect. Saliha, I know you have to have a heart out here in a couple minutes. So I'll let you get your last word in, and then you can tell listeners how to continue the dialogue with you, how to reach you if they want to keep talking about global mental health.
Yeah, thank you. I think that question brings it home, that global mental health is no longer an us and them. It's happening here. It may or may not, you may or may not be part of the community, but you're in this country. And if we can start looking at our own inequalities, racially, socially, and start addressing that, we are doing the work of global mental health at one level, because these ideas will filter in and out of these state country borders. So think about how, when we are participating, how is that shaping part of the larger discourse, wherever you are, right? And then what's the small dialogue you can start as a systemic therapist in your community, in your church, that brings those outside voices in, whatever the outside is in your community. Starting to traverse through that, we are already resourcing ourselves, because we're always outside of somewhere. It's not just the state borders. So that's my take on how you might, because those things create threat. It is already like in that shooting, there were also in the neighboring stores were some Hispanic owners, store owners, and they were starting to get concerned that they are going to be the next people who are going to be targeted. And we know they were already been targeted. It's not like news, but that's the fear. So how do we start having those everyday conversations with people? And we are experts at that. You can go into a market or a store somewhere and say, hey, how's it going for you? Right? How's your family doing? We know how to ask these questions and engage. And I would say that's the work. And they can reach me at my last name, Bava, B-A-V-A, put a DR in front of it, Dr. Bava at gmail.com. And thank you. I love this conversation. I can go on.
Yeah, I love talking to people that are passionate about the field. And you, that again, last story kind of brought it all home. So to me, I took so many things today away from our talk, but especially this idea that I already have as a MFT more skills to do this work than I thought. So if I thought I was very disconnected and I just dropped in today to learn, I mean, you can get involved, and it impacts whether you leave the comfort of your home, so to speak, your metaphorical home, or you're not. It impacts you, and it will continue to influence the field of systemic therapy, which is certainly more than just what goes on in the United States. Laurie, how can people contact you?
I would recommend going to a website. It's globalfamilysystems.com. And this is a project I just completed with a colleague. And so you can access me there. There's a way to email me from that website.
Great. All right. I'd like to remind our listeners that we still have 2 more live AAMFT podcasts to go. Registration is open today for our next live podcast, Friday, April 2nd, 11 to 12 Eastern. A systemic conceptualization of interventions with families in a global context. A very nice companion to the dialogue we've had today, and that is with Dr. Mudita Rastogi. You can find us wherever you find your favorite podcast: Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher. We love hearing from you. You can get a hold of us at the AAMFT on Twitter. I'm at Dr. Eli Live. You can send me an email at eli@northstarcounselingcenter.com. You can go to elikaram.com. We listen to your feedback. It really informs what we do on the podcast now in our 3rd season. You can go back and hear all of the archives, including that interview with Fred Piercy that Laurie mentioned that talks about the international effort there. And once again, we thank you for stopping in and listening. And until next time, my friends, stay systemic.